Good morning, Kolani.
Do you think that this government has a coordinated plan and a clear plan on how to deal with the issues?
Well, it's a huge challenge that the governor has imposed on on government on one hand, but also on all the stakeholders, including business and labor and other social partners in society. When it comes to government, we think they show greater determination during crisis time. For example, the convening of all the representatives of social partners by government post Marikana was something that was welcome, but it seemed like it was sporadic. It rallied all the partners to commit to doing things that will make sure that Marikana doesn't happen again. But of course, the crisis that we're faced with now is that of low growth in the short term, which will not address the challenges of unemployment. Therefore, decisive action indeed is required from government to make sure that that particular challenge of growth that will be inclusive does become a reality.
Because again, the complaint that you're hearing from commentators is that, as you say, they are able to put together social partners for talking, but there's no action. The follow through is lacking.
Well, we as business clearly would like to see government as a social partner, not as a social adversary. Clearly not an enemy. We want to encourage them to behave like a critical and leader of these social partnerships. We are obviously concerned, on one hand, as business, that we reach an agreement at NEDLAC as all the social partners, but Parliament, for example, on labour law reforms, seems to take us a step backwards. And those are sort of things that are mixed signals that say maybe all of us as a society, including institutions like Parliament, seemingly are collectively indecisive in dealing with the challenges that are faced with that are facing us. It's a major concern.
I suspect that part of what also the Reserve Bank governor was talking about is something that you were quoted in a newspaper talking about yesterday: the NDP, the development plan, national development plan, and its status in society, especially given the fact that some political parties or political factions, if you will, seem to be opposed to it. Particularly NUMSA and the SACP have got a view on this matter. What is your view on the NDP?
Well, as a Black Business Council, we clearly support the National Development Plan. We were consulted as a critical constituency after the diagnostic report, which we were very unhappy with, especially in terms of how it characterized the lack of transformation in the economy or the lack of sufficient deregulation of the economy. We made our inputs. We're not entirely satisfied with how the National Development Plan characterizes the transformation in our society. Notwithstanding that, as a Black Business Council, we are saying we cannot throw the baby with the bathwater. The National Development Plan is a good starting point that will serve as a buoy to all of society to say that's the vision for our country 17 years hence. And I think we should embrace it. That's our attitude. We cannot allow the National Development Plan, which is the best outcome of South Africa post-1994, to be really a football that will be kicked left, right, and center.
Happening now when we're hearing voices from NUMSA, the SACP, do you think people are making it a political football?
I cannot talk for NUMSA, I cannot talk for SACP, but certainly from the vantage point where I am, it does, the fact that it's being kicked left, right, and center by such critical players from Labour and the party. By the way, I'm not so sure whether the party has really kicked it out. It said, from what I heard, it said it's concerned about certain elements, but it says let's embrace it. It's a good starting point. Mm-hmm. So our view is that let's move. That's a good departure point. That says NDP is not a picture perfect, but let's use it as a good starting point to rally the country towards greater growth in the economy, towards greater employment creation in the economy, towards the country becoming a lot more competitive vis-a-vis our peers elsewhere in the world.
On the line, I beg your pardon, I now am joined by the Economic Development Minister, Minister Ibrahim Patel. Minister, good morning to you.
Kulani, and to the listeners.
Thank you very much. Minister, I would specifically like you to respond to the challenge thrown out by the Reserve Bank governor yesterday. She is talking about the need for decisive leadership from government.
I think, Kulani, what we're seeing in the economy right now are a number of steps taken by government that does provide the basis for long-term growth and for job creation. Yesterday, we launched a new factory in Atlantis that is a Chinese investor that will be making television sets and fridges here in South Africa. More recently, we announced the speeded up rollout of our infrastructure development plan. And of course, we're now talking to the business community and to organized labor about developing a common vision on particular aspects of the economy. So these are firm steps. They're taken in the context of difficult global economic circumstances. But I think we're on the right path.
And you are talking about really good things that are happening, but the problem with it is that they don't seem to be coordinated. They seem to be happening and incidental, just happening there, and they are not part of a coordinated plan.
I think there's scope to improve coordination in what is done by the business community and by organized labor and by government to ensure that we align our various programs. Absolutely right, Kulani. But this is not something that you can impose in a democracy. It's something that through voice, through dialogue, you get there. One of the most difficult challenges we took on in 1994 was to build a common vision in a society characterized by deep levels of poverty and high levels of inequality. And in those circumstances, when you have a democracy, when people are allowed to associate, when businesses are able to make decisions about investment, government's role is to constantly incentivize or use regulation to ensure that there is some alignment. And I think over the last number of years, we've got many of that right. But bear in mind also in an open economy, in a country that is part of a globally connected world, some of the headwinds of what happens out there, what happens in the Eurozone, what happens to the growth rate of China, impacts very, very greatly on our domestic prospects.
But domestic issues should be dealt with decisively by government. Let me again pick up on the issue of the unrest in the mining sector. And people are saying that government has got to put its foot down once and for all and say, look, we are a democracy, union activities allowed, and so on, but it all has got to happen within the law. And anyone who does anything outside the law will be dealt with. It doesn't matter whether they're part of the alliance or not.
Indeed. And in fact, in October last year, we went one step further, Polani. We got the trade union movement and the business community to sign on to a statement issued by the president in which everybody committed to the resolution of industrial disputes in a peaceful manner, and we gave an unequivocal message that violence cannot be tolerated in any form in industrial action. Yes, there is freedom of association and the right to strike, but there's absolutely no basis for intimidation or violence to be used in these things. And so that is a clear message. Now the law enforcement agencies need to follow that up, and in fact, they are taking some steps. You've seen the actions in the mining sectors by the law enforcement agencies. But ultimately, it's not just a law and order issue. Ultimately, we've got to address also the underlying challenges, the difficulties many workers face with living conditions. And after the crisis in Rustenburg last year, we've set up a team that draws on the mining industry itself, as well as the resources that government can put in place. And Minister Chabani is leading that. So we've got to address those kind of sources of conflict and difficulties. And of course, also, we face now the challenge to our governing system of how to manage a multi-union environment, how to deal with the rights of the established union, whilst at the same time recognizing changes that may be happening in the industrial relations environment.
Thus far and no further, especially because we know that the reason why there's uncertainty, we've seen what happens to the currency and so on, is simply because people are looking at what the instability that is happening.
I think we must be a bit more cautious about those kind of broad brush comments, Tulani. Let me make 2 points. We cannot trample over the constitutional rights of people, and at the same time, we've got to ensure that violence and intimidation doesn't become a feature of our society. So what is it that government needs to do? It needs to sit down with the parties and through dialogue ensure that, in fact, we deal with our matters properly. And secondly, look at the global economy. We have a lot of uncertainty about growth prospects, and it's affecting many developing countries. The rand is one of those bellwether currencies because it's so highly traded. Very often, the first uncertainties in the global north in developed countries about the prospects of long-term growth manifest itself in them selling off the highly liquid, the highly traded currencies in developing countries. There's a little bit more of a complex story with the currency than simply what government may or may not be doing.
Okay.